what about what MLK was saying, or preaching or promoting was Marxist? Because at least from my perspective, and maybe this is true of other Americans, his whole thing was that we should be treating each race with equality, that you should be judged based off his famous line is, I have a dream. People will be able to be judged by the content of their character and not the color of their skin. But yet somehow he has been used as the voice for all sorts of evils that look nothing like that in America.
Yeah. So it's a lot of what he said, but it's also the tactics and the way in which he said it. He was carrying forward something called cultural Marxism, where
Mm,
many who are familiar with Marxism know it's a battle of class struggle.
right.
The proletariats and the bourgeoisie, and this epic war for power. Um, they try to really push this Marxist ideology in London in the mid 1800s. The
Mm,
problem that they had was they weren't able to win the urban poor to their side. They weren't able to radicalize them at as fast of a pace as they wanted to. And the reason that they weren't was because of someone named Charles Spurgeon,
mm,
who was a contemporary to Marx and Engels in London. Also, a contemporary of theirs was Charles Darwin. They all lived in London at the same time.
mm,
Um, so while Darwin was writing on the origin of the species, which gave us Darwinian evolution, here was Marx and Engels writing the Communist Manifesto. And at the same time, there was Charles Spurgeon preaching the gospel at the Metropolitan Tabernacle.
right.
And he was drawing these large crowds, Spurgeon was. And he actually, in some of his sermons, preached against socialism and said that
Mm,
the gospel, that the answer is the gospel. In fact, there was this game that was popular in London at the time called Confessions, where an adolescent will um, interrogate a friend of theirs by asking them a series of questions, and then they'll write those questions down or answers down. And so Jenny Marx, Karl Marx's daughter, played this game with his friend Charles or Friedrich Engels, and she asked him the character that you hate the most. And in answer to this question, Friedrich Engels wrote one word, and that word was Spurgeon. They
mm,
didn't like Spurgeon because he was actually preaching the gospel and preaching against not only socialism, but all these other ideologies that set themselves up as enemies of the knowledge of God. And
mm,
so they weren't able to get the foothold that they wanted, even though they were able to have some success coming out of the 19th century. So as you get into the 20th century, Marxism is really trying to find its way not only into the West but into America. And the way that it would do it was through the so-called Negro community, the black community. This is evidenced by the fact that in, I think it was 1920, there was a white journalist, a muckraker journalist named John Reed, and he was a delegate to the Communist Comintern. He went to Moscow, and they were trying to figure out how to penetrate America with communist ideology.
mm,
And this journalist, John Reed, said, well, the problem is, he said, we can use a Negro to spearhead communism into America because they're a marginalized group.
yep.
The problem is that they are not politically conscious. We need to raise the political consciousness of the American Negro, and in so doing, we can have our ushering in of communist ideology. So
Mm,
Vladimir Lenin himself greenlit the use of any means necessary to raise the political consciousness of the American Negro. As Thomas Sowell documents, as I document, as other scholars document, in the 1920s, well, really from the end of slavery to the 1920s, well into the 1940s, you had this upward mobility of black success in America. You had all these springing up of so-called black Wall Streets, these business districts
mm-hmm,
that were taking place, that were taking root. You had uh, blacks really taking advantage of the free market and doing quite well for themselves. You see this the you see black literacy trending in the right direction, home ownership trending in the right direction, family formation. The marriage rates were just off the charts as far as
Mm.
so-called blacks are concerned. It was all trending in the right direction. And the problem that John Reed and the Comintern had is that the American Negro is making his way in America by capitalistic means, and they didn't like that.
Mm.
The further that imperialism and capitalism spreads, the less of a chance that communists have actually to take root and basically imperialize by way of their ideology. And so the objective was to try to raise political consciousness, try to make all the Negroes woke, as it were,
Yep.
by pointing out the grievances, pointing out the disparities, pointing out the unfairness. So again, Vladimir Lenin greenlit this plan to raise a political consciousness, and over the course of the 1920s, for the rest of the decade into the 30s, you saw all these race riots springing up seemingly out of nowhere. No one knew what the hidden hand was, but all these race riots springing up seemingly out of nowhere, a lot of black businesses being burned down, and then just like magic, in the newspaper you see, "Are you tired of racism? Join the NAACP, join the IWW, join all of these other communist front groups." And so it's like we burn down your business and then we chase you into the arms or into the bosom of the communists who have the answer and who can figure it all out for you. So if I'm Joe the shoe
Mm.
store owner and tomorrow I don't have a business to go to, but I see in the newspaper join this organization that's supposed to help protect me against racial discrimination, I might be more inclined to do that if I don't have principles. And so again, this is the kind of milieu
Right.
that was going on prior to the birth of Dr. King,
Mm.
using kind of communist tactics to try to spread and open up and broaden political what's the word conscience.
Mm.
So by the time King comes to the table, he is well versed in those kind of tactics, that kind of ideology. There was something called the National Negro Congress, which was started under the FDR administration with the help of Joseph Stalin. So you had the Feds and you had the Soviet Union kind of collaborating to create the National Negro Congress, which was a preeminent civil rights movement in the 1960s, or I'm sorry, 30s. The National Negro Congress would start these kind of little sister, little brother communist front groups, one of which was called the Southern Youth Congress or something like that.
Mm.
Yeah, the Southern Negro Youth Congress, SNYC. And the Southern Negro Youth Congress would host all these events across the South, including in Alabama and Georgia. And present at many of these events were none other than Martin Luther King Sr., Martin Luther King's father. Also present at these events was Rosa Parks and Ralph Abernathy, who were all older than Martin Luther King Jr.
Mm.
And and so they were aware that these were communist front groups, but they would go to these events and they would be inspired to then go back into their communities and kind of carry the water for this ideology, as it were. And so by the time King comes of age and he goes off to college and he's reading Marx, he's reading Niebuhr, he's reading all of these radicals, Walter Rauschenbusch and others, and he comes of age. He's learning to, in a sense, mask this communist Marxist ideology in language that is receptive to the general public. There's a book called Public Opinion that was written by Walter Lippmann, I think in 1921 or 1922. But he explains what King would later go on to do, in that if a leader wishes to push a policy of campaign, what that leader must do is speak language and use symbols that the public is familiar with. He
Mm-hmm.
speaks to symbols of patriotism, symbols of religion, uh, uh, pinches grievances, such to resonate with the public. And the public, says Walter Lippmann, moving hither and thither, will move in towards this leader who's using the symbols that they're familiar with, such to where they will require and even demand that this leader presents a policy of campaign that they can get behind. So once they get to that place, once you get into their good graces, you're then able to push a policy, push a campaign, and the public will follow that campaign. Never mind the fact that it is rhetorically opposed to the symbols that you were using from the very beginning. Doesn't matter that they don't quite match up. What matters is now you as a figure is considered to be a trustworthy person. So it doesn't matter that there's a
Mm.
contradiction between this policy of campaign that you're trying to push and the rhetoric that you use to get into their good graces. That's Martin Luther King. Um, During his "I Have a Dream" speech, which wasn't written by him, was written by his handlers. The,
Hmm.
we you see things like, he says things, for example, like, um, the Negro will never be free until justice rolls down like waters. Well, when he says justice, he's not referring to biblical justice. He's referring to social justice, because he would go on to use the term social justice in a lot of other speeches and presentations and press conferences. Uh, Specifically, he said in a speech that he delivered at Stanford University that social justice is the only and absolute guarantor of riot preventions. In other words, you'll continue to have riots in America unless you implement social justice. Social justice is
Mm.
rooted in Marxism. It's not rooted in Christianity. It's not rooted in the American way of life and Western civilization. No, social justice is redistribution of wealth. That's what social justice is. He said in a number of speeches that the only way that the Negro will be made equal is through a universal basic income. So he's talking about universal basic income. He's talking about a radical redistribution of wealth. He's talking
Mm.
about social justice. He's talking about many other things that are very socialist, very Marxist in
Right.
essence. So when he uses words like freedom, right? Again, freedom, listening to that from the surface kind of normie level, one would think, well, yeah, why not? We want freedom, right?
Right.
But the freedom that he's referring to when he says, for example, in his "I Have a Dream" speech, that the American Negro, 100 years after the Emancipation Proclamation, still is not free. We want freedom. And then he ends the speech, free at last, thank God Almighty, we're free at last. Um, what he's talking about, once again, is socialist policies. Because the question becomes, okay, King, if you say the Negro is not free, how must the Negro get his freedom? He answered that question, whether it be in the NBC interview where he's standing at the podium of the Ebenezer Baptist Church and he's being interviewed by the reporter. That the reporter asked him in so many words, how was the Negro to be made free? And he said, well, there was a time in our struggle where we had a lot of white people who were aligned with us, but they were just aggrieved by the fact that we were being mistreated by Bull Connor and some of these sheriffs in the South. But as soon as we started asking for redistribution of wealth, and as soon as we started asking for them to eradicate poverty and all the things, they abandoned us because they don't really want us to be free. That's what he said.
Mm.
And so, again, the way that he interprets freedom is through give me your stuff. Like, I want the same as you, not only in terms of, equality of opportunity, but I literally want what you have. That's what redistribution of wealth is.
Yeah.
So,
Right.
again, you have to really understand what Marxism is, what cultural Marxism is, in order to
Hmm.
understand, and then listen closely to King and what he's saying, in order to really conclude that, yeah, this guy was literally touting Marxism. Sorry for my long-winded way of answering your question, but you really have to give
No.
a backdrop of where like the milieu into which he was born, how he was educated, and what he was actually saying in his speeches in order to answer that question.
No. Yeah, no, I think that's super important because, again, from the outside, it seems, and I don't know how many. It seems like he is kind of this um, equality for all, not necessarily equity for all, but obviously, based off what you're saying, he was an equity for all preacher. I'll call him just because that seems to be more what he was than not of the true gospel of Christ, but of a social gospel.